Welcome to Gamma Ray. These are 3 moments we love from comics history. There have been a lot of huge events and important moments in comic book history. Now, at a time where comic books are possibly more part of our culture than ever, we wanted to take a look back at some of the biggest and most important ones in the history of the medium. These 3 moments are not the most important, the best, or the only. They aren't even ranked in any kind of order of importance. They are just 3 that are important to us, and we wanted to share with you. They tell a story about the history of the humble comic and remind us of where we came from and where we are going. Number 3, Action Comics. Number 1. We can't talk about major moments in comic book history without talking about Action Comics. Number 1. Comic books and strips had existed before the Man of Steel hit the newsstand in 1938, but there were no tales of the superhero genre as we'd perceive it today. Pulp heroes, as they were called, named after the cheap paper used to print the books, were commonly detective and adventurer types, plus a sprinkle of westerns. There were no superpowers or costumes, and the likes of Dick Tracy and Flash Gordon were dominant icons. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster broke that trend with the release of the first appearance of Superman. It wasn't some simple and safe, non-divisive play into kids' content either. Superman was born in the politics of working-class depression milieu that forged his creators. The first time we ever see the Big Blue Boy Scout, he's foiling a lynching, roughing up war profiteers, breaking a wrongly convicted murderer out of prison after he's been sentenced to death row, and beating his ideology into a domestic abuser. The kind of superpower Tom Joad, or maybe even more Jim Casey, Superman took on gangsters like everyone else, but was also very intent on taking on corruption and powerful businessmen and politicians. Until World War II, he was a cartoon hero for the New Deal and unilaterally stood up for the little guy, exploited by the man. Siegel and Shuster originally conceived Superman as a newspaper strip which you can easily see because there's a button or mini cliffhang in the last panel of each tier of that original story. But after being rejected from every single newspaper they could find, they reluctantly agreed to let the fledgling publisher, National, who was later renamed DC after its series Detective Comics, run its cover feature on their brand new title. The company changed ownership between accepting and publishing the story, and the new powers that be thought the debut issue's now iconic cover, Superman smashing a mobster's car into a mountain, was so fucking stupid, they banned the alien from ever appearing on any future covers. That was, of course, until sales suddenly started and kept rising. They found that kids weren't going to the newsstand asking for Action Comics, they were asking for Superman. It was the start of both a new genre and an entire industry. Action Comics number 1 launched the golden age of comics and kicked off the superhero storylines that now dominate popular culture. Superman is the most recognizable fictional character in modern history, the S on his chest being as prolific a symbol around the world as some religious iconography. The first appearance of Superman is widely considered the most valuable comic book in the world. A copy sold back in 2014 for over $3 million. It sounds insane, but it's money well spent. Seriously, what are the chances that the issue's value, both monetarily and historically, will ever deteriorate in the foreseeable future? Superman may be a bit of a divisive figure to some these days, but his role in ushering in a new era of storytelling cannot and should not be undervalued. Number 2, Fantastic Four, number 52. Let's be honest, comic books have not traditionally had the most diverse fictional worlds. This is largely due to the standards of the 40s and 50s. We're not aiming to villainize the people of that time, we're simply saying that because of those standards, the superheroes most people grew up with were pretty much all white, American or American alien Kryptonians, and straight. The 1940s may have been the golden age of comics, but it was certainly not golden in the ways African Americans were portrayed. The Spirit's sidekick, Ebony White, the Young Allies member Whitewash Jones, and most other characters on the stands touted grotesquely large lips and were basically ripped straight from minstrel shows. This was the state of the newsstand when Orrin C. Evans found himself needing a job. Evans was the first African-American reporter to be on staff as a general reporter of a mainstream, white-run newspaper. But in 1947, the Philadelphia Record went out of business following a strike. So Evans teamed up with co-workers to deal with those terrible black characters he saw every day at the stands. He wanted to create something new for comics, strong, positive depictions of people who looked like him. In 1947, they launched All Negro Comics number 1, the first comic book series written and drawn entirely by African-American creators. While each of the artists likely wrote their own strips, Evans oversaw the whole endeavor and made sure that all of the heroes were depicted non-stereotypically. Evans' brother, George, drew Lion Man, while John Terrell wrote the lead in the series, Ace Harlem. Sadly, when Evans went to produce a second issue, the company that sold the physical paper for the first issue was no longer willing to sell to him, nor would any other paper company. Seriously, they literally wouldn't sell the man fucking paper to print on. He went back to journalism and spent the rest of his life working at the papers. But it's important to acknowledge that all-Negro comics tales like Ace Harlem were forerunners of black heroes. About 20 years after Evans tried to change the depiction of black people in funny books, Black Panther, the first black superhero to be featured in mainstream American comic books, made his first appearance. As Marvel grew in popularity, Lee and Kirby began to use the fame of their comic book series to address societal issues of the era. When he reflected on Black Panther, Kirby noted that, for human reasons, as the leading cartoonist of the time, he should be doing a black superhero. He began developing a new black hero for Marvel with the initial intent that that character would have his own new series. But Marvel's then restrictive distribution system, which limited how many ongoing series they could release, forced Black Panther into the pages of Fantastic Four number 52 instead. Fantastic Four number 52, which was written and drawn by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, saw the flagship team of Marvel Comics head to Wakanda by invitation of the king himself. T'Challa battled them to test their strength before asking for their help. He proceeds to single-handedly defeat the entire team. They did not simply want to introduce a new black superhero. It was important to make him stand out from the crowd. Originally, Kirby designed Black Panther's costume with a cowled mask like Batman, but reports say that publisher Martin Goodman was afraid that they'd have a hard time being placed on stands with an openly black character on the cover, so they gave Panther a full face mask. His name was not related to the political Black Panthers, which had not officially formed yet, but the name had been used in political circles, so Kirby and Lee did not coin it either. The success of the Black Panther paved the way for all other black superheroes who followed. 3 years later, in 1969, Marvel would also introduce the Falcon, Captain America's longtime friend and eventual successor, paving the way for Storm, Luke Cage, and many more to come. DC was a lot slower in bringing diversity into their comics. The first black DC superhero was Green Lantern's John Stewart, who made his debut in 1971. Fantastic Four number 52 hit newsstands and let the world know black heroes were finally and successfully the type of characters Orrin Evans strived for, and they were here to stay. Number 1, Youngblood, Spawn, Savage Dragon, Shadowhawk, Wildcats, and Cyberforce number 1. In 1992, perms are still in fashion. Every theater is stacked with Whoopi Goldberg and Sister Act, and comic books are hotter than they've ever been. Think about it. Tim Burton's Batman had brought comic books to a new level in 1989. Superhero merch is lining the shelves of stores, and comic book shops are springing up all over the country. In June of 1990, Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man number 1 had become the best-selling comic issue of all time, with 2.5 million copies. In June 1991, Rob Layfield's X-Force number 1 broke McFarlane's record with 5 million copies sold. Just 2 months after that, Jim Lee's X-Men number 1 trounced all previous numbers, selling 8.1 million copies. Marvel Comics just went public and the stock is flying up in value. Publishers have all seen some serious uptick in sales, but Marvel is definitely the biggest cat in town. But there's something else brewing behind the scenes. On the other side of town, comic book creators Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, and Jim Valentino have dinner with Dave Ulbrich, editor-in-chief of Malibu Comics, a small but established publishing company that was very sympathetic to creator ownership. Basically, illustrators doing some of the very popular work for Marvel are growing very frustrated with the company's work-for-hire policies. Their main issue is that the artwork and new characters they create are being franchised beyond the comics, but the artists are only receiving standard page rates for their illustration work and modest royalties only for the comic sales. In December of 1991, some of Marvel's heaviest hitters approached Marvel president Terry Stewart, emphasizing that the company's policies are unfair and demanded creator ownership and control. Suffice to say, Marvel does not agree to the demands. Feet are put down, resignations are made, and in a month, a deal had been worked out with Malibu Comics for production and distribution, and a name for the new company is chosen. 7 names emerge as the founders. Illustrators Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silvestri, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino, and Wilk Portacio. But again, these weren't just some hot-headed, hotshot, young and entitled creators. These were the people behind the 3 biggest comics ever at the top of their game. Image's organizing charter had 2 key provisions. Number 1, Image would not own any creator's work. The creator would. Number 2, No Image partner would interfere creatively or financially with any other partner's work. Image itself would own no intellectual property except the company's trademarks, its name, and its logo, which were designed by writer Hank Canals. Each Image partner founded his own studio, which published under the Image banner, but was autonomous from any central editorial control. The impact of this move was huge. It was a clunky start, but each of the new books became a smash, topping sales charts and establishing new benchmarks for the success of comics made outside of Marvel and DC. While the collective democracy approach meant that some questionable titles ended up getting released over the years, the founders also quickly opened up their doors to other writers and artists who wanted to create their own worlds. The effects of Image's success were immediate and expansive. Creator-owned comics weren't just some niche market oddity that could be ignored any longer. Larger publishers began to realize that they needed to offer better deals. Image had both some high times and some very low ones in its 25-plus years since. But despite the lack of consistency, the openness of its system allowed for some of the most distinctive voices to give the world most of the coolest, craziest, strangest, silliest, and smartest titles that one could ever hope for. 7 creators wanted a better deal, wanted to own their own creations, and set out to demand it. They led a revolution, and comics is better for that. That's all for us this week. Check out all the stuff going on at San Diego Comic-Con. Like, subscribe, and do all the things as usual. We'll see you next week.